Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story, and tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
The January morning at Hogwarts in 2025 began the same way as thousands of mornings before it, with a bell that rang through the castle corridors, awakening sleepy students. But when Elara Stonebridge came down to the Great Hall for breakfast, she immediately noticed something new. Near the staff table stood strange metallic constructions that looked like giant mirrors in silver frames, softly pulsing with blue light. They appeared both magical and oddly modern, as if someone had combined a crystal ball with a Muggle computer monitor. Students whispered about the unfamiliar objects, and Professor McGonagall stood beside them with a tall man in dark blue robes decorated with glittering silver runes. "What are those things?" Elara muttered, sitting down next to her friends at the Gryffindor table. Her auburn hair, always a bit unruly, looked particularly chaotic today after the winter night in the tower dormitory. Aziz Al-Fard, her best friend from Ravenclaw, who always knew all the latest news thanks to his insatiable curiosity, leaned toward her across the gaps between tables. His dark eyes burned with excitement. "Those are magical interactive panels. MIPs," he whispered, barely containing his enthusiasm. "My father wrote about them in a letter. They were developed at the Ministry with participation from the best magical researchers and even some Muggle technologists. They're supposed to revolutionize learning." "What do they do?" asked Poppy Macmillan, joining them. Her fluffy blonde hair was neatly braided, and her face shone with that special smile she greeted everything new and interesting with. As heir to an ancient family of healers, Poppy was always interested in innovations, especially those that could help people. "I don't know exactly," Aziz admitted, "but apparently they allow you to practice spells in a safe virtual environment, and also—" He was interrupted by the deep voice of Dorian Knott, who approached them from the Slytherin table. Unlike the others, he looked not excited but warily restrained. "And also record your every move, every spell, every thought," he said quietly. "My grandfather told me about similar devices that Voldemort wanted to use to control wizards." An awkward silence hung in the air. Dorian rarely mentioned his family history, and when he did, it was always with pain and shame. His grandfather, Theo Knott Sr., had been one of Voldemort's most devoted Death Eaters, and now his grandson was trying to prove that the new generation of Knotts was completely different. Elara placed a hand on Dorian's shoulder. After 4 years of studying together, she had learned to understand him better than most people. Beneath his cold Slytherin mask hid a boy who feared repeating his family's mistakes. "Dorian, this is completely different," she said gently. "Look, Professor McGonagall is standing right there. She would never allow anything dangerous in Hogwarts." Indeed, the headmistress looked calm and confident, though Elara noticed a certain wariness in her eyes that others might not have caught. Minerva McGonagall had always been cautious when it came to innovations, especially after all the horrors of the war. Meanwhile, the tall man in dark blue robes raised his wand, and his voice magically echoed throughout the hall. "Greetings, students of Hogwarts. I am Professor Elijah Stormwind, representative of the Department of Magical Innovations at the Ministry of Magic. Today we begin implementing a revolutionary educational system that will change your understanding of magic forever." His voice was confident and captivating, like that of a researcher who had just discovered a new star. The silver runes on his robes twinkled merrily in the light of the morning sun, streaming through the frozen windows of the Great Hall. "The magical interactive panels," he continued, waving his wand toward the strange mirrors, "will allow you to practice the most complex spells without risk to yourselves or those around you. They create precise simulations of magical situations, analyze your technique, and give personalized recommendations for improvement." One of the mirrors came to life, showing a three-dimensional image of a classroom where a virtual student performed the Expelliarmus spell. The image was so realistic it seemed as if a real person was standing in a glass box. Students stirred with general excitement. Someone shouted, "Wow!" and applause came from the Ravenclaw table. But Elara noticed that not everyone looked pleased. Several portraits on the walls looked grimly at the new devices, and nearly headless Nick, Gryffindor's ghost, shook his head anxiously. "Furthermore," Professor Stormwind continued, "the MIPs are integrated with the global magical network. You'll be able to communicate with students from other magical schools around the world, study their unique techniques, participate in international magical projects. This did sound exciting. Elara tried to imagine talking with students from Durmstrang or Bosbatons, studying magical traditions from Ilvermorny, or even exotic spells from African schools of witchcraft. But most importantly, the professor's voice became more solemn. These systems will help us create a new generation of wizards, free from the superstitions of the past, ready for the challenges of the modern world. At these words, Elara noticed how several professors exchanged restrained glances. Professor Flitwick subtly frowned, and Professor Slughorn thoughtfully stroked his beard. It seemed that not all the faculty were thrilled about liberation from the superstitions of the past. After breakfast, the friends went to their first class, Defense Against the Dark Arts, now taught by Professor James Potter. The son of the famous Harry Potter had proven to be an excellent teacher who combined his father's practical skills with a deep understanding of how the war had changed the magical world. The defense classroom had been completely redesigned after the war. Instead of the dark, heavy furniture that Hogwarts remembered from the times of various teachers of this subject, an atmosphere of light and hope prevailed here. The walls were decorated with paintings depicting victorious moments from the war, but not cruel battles, but moments of unity, courage, and sacrifice. One painting showed Neville Longbottom leading students through the castle's secret passages. Another showed Poppy's mother, Pomona Sprout, and hundreds of others fighting side by side regardless of background or status. In a corner of the classroom stood a small memorial, a transparent crystal pyramid with golden lights floating inside, each symbolizing a life lost during the war. The inscription by the pyramid simply read, "They died so we could learn together." "Good morning, fourth years." Professor Potter greeted them cheerfully. He was young, only 10 years older than his students, but his green eyes had the same depth as those of his famous father. "Today we begin studying a new topic, protective spells in the age of technological integration." He waved his wand, and diagrams appeared on the blackboard, showing how traditional protective charms could interact with new magical technological devices. "As you know," he began, walking between the desks, "the modern magical world is rapidly changing. The MIPs you just saw in the Great Hall are only the beginning. But with new possibilities come new threats." Elara raised her hand. "Professor, what threats exactly? Don't magical technologies make us stronger?" Professor Potter smiled, not with the condescending smile of an adult to a child, but with the smile of a teacher who rejoiced at an intelligent question. "Excellent question, Miss Stonebridge. Technologies can indeed make us stronger, but they can also make us dependent. What happens if these systems are hacked or captured by enemies? What if we become so reliant on artificial magical assistance that we forget how to create real miracles with our own hands?" Aziz raised his hand. "But Professor, technologies are just tools. Wizards have always used tools, wands, cauldrons, crystal balls." "Correct, Mr. Alferd. But think about the difference. A wand amplifies your own magic. It doesn't replace it. When you use a MIP to simulate a spell, who is really creating the magic, you or the machine?" A thoughtful silence fell over the class. This was not an easy question, and Elara felt new thoughts beginning to form in her head. Dorian, who usually remained silent during lessons, suddenly spoke up. "What if these technologies are used for control again? History has a tendency to repeat itself." Professor Potter nodded with understanding. "Your concerns are completely justified, Mr. Knott. That's exactly why we study defense. Not only from dark wizards, but from dark uses of any tools." The lesson continued with practical exercises in traditional defensive spells, but the atmosphere remained thoughtful. Elara noticed that even the simplest Protego spells came out somehow reluctantly, as if magic itself was troubled by something. After class, the friends went to the library, where another surprise awaited them. Part of the reading room had been partitioned off, and several more MIPs were being installed there. Workers in blue robes carefully connected cables to the castle walls, and their supervisor, a young witch with red hair, was recording something on a magical tablet. "Excuse me," Elara addressed her. "What are you doing with the walls?" The woman looked up and smiled. "Ah, a student. I'm Morgana Wells, a magical engineer. We're connecting the MIPs to the castle's energy system. Hogwarts is a living magical organism, you see? It generates enormous amounts of magical energy itself, and we've learned to use it for our needs." "Is it safe?" asked Aziz with professional curiosity. "Of course," Morgana assured them. We've conducted thousands of tests. The castle won't even notice such insignificant energy consumption. But as she said this, one of the wall torches suddenly went out, then flared up again with brighter flame. Morgana quickly wrote something in her tablet. "Just a technical malfunction," she muttered. "Will be fixed by tomorrow." The friends spent the rest of the day exploring the changes in the castle. MIPs were being installed everywhere, in charms classes, transfiguration potions. With each new panel, something intangible changed in Hogwarts' atmosphere. The portraits became increasingly grim and irritable. Sir Cadogan even refused to let several students pass until they named 5 advantages of a traditional knightly sword over these newfangled shiny nonsense. The ghosts also behaved strangely. Moaning Myrtle hid in her bathroom and refused to come out, and the Bloody Baron frightened students more than usual, as if trying to prove that old fears still had power. The strangest thing was that the castle itself began to complain. Doors sometimes refused to open even to correct passwords, staircases stopped midway, and water began dripping from some walls, though there were no leaks. That evening, sitting in the Gryffindor common room by the fireplace, Elara shared her observations with her friends. Poppy had come from Hufflepuff and Dorian from Slytherin, which was unusual since interhouse meetings in common rooms weren't encouraged. But after the war, many rules had become less strict. "Do you notice it too?" Elara asked quietly, so other Gryffindors wouldn't hear. "The castle seems dissatisfied?" "I thought it was just my imagination," Poppy admitted. "But today, when I passed the fat lady's portrait, she said something strange. Something about how walls remember those who live in them, but forget those who leave them." Aziz leaned closer. "Did you know what I discovered? I researched the energy characteristics of the MIPs. They consume much more magical energy than that engineer said. And it's not just energy, it's complex, structured magic. Almost as if. As if what?" Dorian prompted. "As if they're not just consuming energy, but changing it. Transforming the castle's magical field into something else." Elara felt an unpleasant chill. What will happen if they change too much? No one could answer that question. The next day they had their first practical session with MIPs in Charms class. Professor Flitwick looked less enthusiastic than usual when introducing students to new magical instruments. "Today," he squeaked, standing on his usual pile of books, "we'll try basic spells through the magical interactive panels. Please remember, this is only an auxiliary tool, not a replacement for real magic." Students took turns approaching the panels. When Elara's turn came, she placed her hand on the smooth surface, and the panel came to life, showing a virtual classroom with floating feathers. "Perform the Wingardium Leviosa spell," instructed a voice from the panel. Elara raised her wand and spoke the familiar words. On screen, the virtual feather flew up into the air, and the panel made an approving sound. "Excellent. Your technique is 94% up to standard. Recommendations for improvement: increase wand movement strength by 12%, improve spell pronunciation clarity." It was impressive, but somehow empty. Elara felt she had created an illusion of magic, not a real miracle. The virtual feather had no life. It was just pixels of light. When Aziz took his test, something strange happened. He was performing a complex transfiguration spell, transforming a virtual stone into a bird, and suddenly the panel flickered and showed not a bird, but something else, a dark figure in a hood reaching hands toward the screen. "What was that?" Poppy whispered. Aziz shuddered and jerked his hand away from the panel. "I don't know. It seemed like someone was watching me from inside." Professor Flitwick quickly ran to the panel and tapped it with his wand. The image returned to normal. "Technical malfunction," he muttered, but Elara noticed anxiety in his eyes. "Let's continue with traditional methods." The rest of the lesson passed normally, but the atmosphere remained tense. Students kept glancing at the MIPs, as if waiting for them to show something incomprehensible again. During lunch, Professor Stormwind announced that next week would begin intensive integration sessions, daily lessons with MIPs for all years. He also reported that representatives from other magical schools would come to Hogwarts to observe the implementation of the new system. "This will be a triumph of modern magical education," he proclaimed. "Hogwarts will become a model for the entire magical world." But as he said this, the great chandelier above the great hall suddenly swayed, though there was no wind. Several candles on it went out and wouldn't relight. Professor McGonagall stood and announced that due to technical work, part of the castle would be temporarily closed to students. The forbidden zones included several secret passages, and the old astronomy tower. "For your safety," she added, but her voice sounded as if she herself didn't entirely believe in the safety of the situation. That evening, Elara couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed in the fourth-year dormitory and listened to the sounds of the castle. Usually Hogwarts at night was full of familiar sounds, creaking wood, distant laughter from ghosts, sometimes footsteps of students going to the bathroom. But tonight the sounds were different. Somewhere far away came metallic clanging, as if someone was installing something heavy. From time to time there were strange humming sounds, like the work of huge mechanisms. And strangest of all, it seemed the castle itself was groaning, as if it was in pain. Elara got up and went to the window. Through the frosted glass, she saw that several castle windows glowed not with warm yellow candlelight, but with the cold blue glow of MIPs. This light pulsed in some rhythm, like a huge heart beating somewhere in the depths of Hogwarts. And then she noticed something else. By the lake stood a figure, a tall man in a dark cloak, looking at the castle. Even from such a distance, Elara recognized Professor Stormwind. But why was he standing there at night? And why was he holding not a wand, but some strange device that also glowed with blue light? The man stood for a few more minutes, then quickly walked toward the forbidden forest and disappeared into the darkness between the trees. Elara returned to bed, but sleep never came. Questions spun in her head that she couldn't answer. What was really happening to Hogwarts? Why was the castle sick after installing the MIPs? And what was Professor Stormwind doing by the lake at night? One thing she knew for certain. Despite all assurances about safety and innovation, something was wrong. And she and her friends needed to find out what, before it was too late. After all, Hogwarts wasn't just a school. It was home to thousands of students over the centuries. And if this home was in danger, someone had to protect it. Even if that someone had to be an ordinary 14-year-old girl and her friends. When morning finally came, Elara woke with a firm resolution. Today she would begin her own investigation. And whatever she and her friends found, she was ready to fight for her home, even if it meant fighting progress itself. February came to Hogwarts with an unexpected thaw. The snow on the castle grounds began melting faster than usual, forming little streams that cheerfully gurgled between the stone slabs. But along with the spring warmth came new strange phenomena that troubled Elara more and more. A week had passed since the implementation of MIPs, and intensive integration sessions had become a daily reality. Every morning, students spent 2 hours interacting with magical interactive panels, learning spells through virtual simulations, and communicating with students from other magical schools around the world. At first glance, everything was going wonderfully. Students really did master complex spells faster, their technique became more precise, and mistakes became rarer. Aziz had even established contact with a group of researchers from Ilvermorny who were working on a project combining Native American magic with modern methodologies. But Elara noticed what others didn't notice, or more precisely, didn't want to notice. Students were becoming less creative. Their spells worked perfectly in technique, but lost that unpredictable magic that previously made each wizard unique. Even her friends were changing. Aziz, who used to be excited about experiments and unconventional solutions, now precisely followed MIP instructions, rarely deviating from recommended parameters. Poppy, always intuitive in her healing abilities, began relying on panel analytics instead of her own instincts. Even Dorian, despite his initial warnings, increasingly used MIPs to study defensive spells. They just make us better, Aziz convinced Elara when she shared her doubts during one of their evening conversations in the library. Look, my Expelliarmus now has 15% more power and 23% better accuracy. But that's not your Expelliarmus, Elara gently objected. That's a spell created by MIP algorithms. Where's your personality? Your unique magical signature? Aziz looked at her with surprise. Magical signature is an outdated concept. MIPs show that we can all achieve optimal results if we follow the correct parameters. Elara felt a chill of fear. This wasn't the Aziz she knew. The real Aziz would never call individuality an outdated concept. That same evening, she decided to conduct her own research. Waiting until everyone went to bed, she quietly crept through the castle corridors to the library. She needed to find information about similar magical technologies in history, about their possible side effects. The old part of the library, where the most ancient volumes were kept, was barely lit. Elara lit a flashlight using the Lumos spell and began searching among the dusty shelves. Here, among forgotten manuscripts and ancient treatises, there had to be answers. As she passed the History of Magical Innovations section, one of the volumes seemed to fall at her feet by itself. It was a thick book in worn brown binding titled The Dangers of Magic Unification, Historical Examples. Elara opened the book to a random page and immediately found what she was looking for. The chapter was called The Great Standardization of 1847, when magic almost disappeared. According to the text, in the mid-19th century, a group of progressive wizards tried to create a universal magical education system that would force all wizards to use identical techniques to achieve maximum efficiency. The system worked through magical crystals that analyzed and corrected students' magic. Initially, the results were impressive. Wizards really did become more powerful and precise. But after a year, problems began. Magic lost its natural diversity. Spells became mechanical, devoid of life. And most terrifying, the wizards themselves began losing the ability for creative magic without crystal assistance. The project had to be shut down when it became clear that unified magic couldn't handle unpredictable situations. When a magical disease epidemic struck Europe, standardized treatment methods proved ineffective. Only those wizards who had preserved their unique, non-optimal approaches to magic could save the situation. Elara turned the page and found another disturbing detail. The book's author wrote, "The greatest danger lay not in the crystals themselves, but in how they gradually changed students' perception of magic. Young wizards began believing there was only one correct way to cast spells, one correct way to think about magic. They lost the most precious thing, the ability for magical creativity and intuition." Suddenly, Elara heard footsteps in the corridor. She quickly hid the book behind her back and turned off the flashlight, but it was too late. A tall figure with a lantern entered the library. "Miss Stonebridge?" said a familiar voice with surprise. It was Professor McGonagall. "What are you doing here at such a late hour?" Elara knew that lying to the headmistress was pointless. Minerva McGonagall had a special talent for recognizing falsehood. I'm researching the history of magical innovations, Professor," she answered honestly. "I'm troubled by what's happening with the MIPs." McGonagall came closer, and in the light of her lantern, Elara saw that the headmistress's face expressed not anger, but interest and perhaps even relief. "What exactly troubles you?" the professor asked quietly. "My friends are changing," poured out of Elara. "They're becoming the same. As if the MIPs are teaching them not just spells, but how to think about magic. And the castle is changing too. It seems to be resisting these technologies." McGonagall looked at her for a long time, then unexpectedly smiled, not her stern official smile, but a warm, almost grandmotherly one. "Show me what you found," she requested. Elara handed her the book, and the professor quickly read the open page. Her face became increasingly serious. 1847, she muttered. "I heard about this story from my great-grandfather. He was one of those who resisted standardization." She looked at Elara with a penetrating gaze. "Do you understand that your suspicions might be correct? Do you notice it too?" Elara asked hopefully. "It's hard not to notice when you've lived in Hogwarts for over 50 years, McGonagall sighed. "The castle is indeed changing. Its magical aura is becoming more regular, less alive. And the students." She paused. "Students are beginning to think like machines. So what can we do?" Elara asked. The professor raised an eyebrow with surprise. "Well, you won't allow the same thing that happened in 1847 to happen to Hogwarts, will you?" McGonagall smiled again, and this time her smile showed real pride. "Miss Stonebridge, in all my years of teaching, I've met few students who would care more about Hogwarts' soul than their own grades." She thought for a minute. "But officially, I cannot act against a program approved by the ministry. At least, not until there's sufficient evidence. And unofficially? Unofficially, perhaps some students could conduct their own research. For example, study how MIPs affect the castle's magical field and students, or investigate historical parallels." The professor made a significant pause. Of course, such students would have to be very careful and act only within permitted boundaries. Elara understood the hint. "Thank you, Professor. Don't mention it, Miss Stonebridge. And remember, Hogwarts has always protected those who love it. Perhaps it's time to repay it with the same devotion." The next day, Elara called an emergency meeting of their foursome in an empty classroom on the 5th floor. At first, her friends didn't want to listen to her conspiracy theories, but when she showed them excerpts from the book she'd found, the atmosphere changed. This really resembles what's happening now," Poppy said slowly, reading the description of magical standardization symptoms. Yesterday I tried to create a healing potion intuitively, as my mother taught me, but I kept thinking about optimization parameters from the MIPs. And I noticed that my own ideas about combining magic with technology seem less interesting to me than the system's recommendations, Aziz admitted. As if I'm losing trust in my own mind. Dorian was silent for a long time, then said quietly, "My grandfather told me that the most terrible thing about Voldemort's regime wasn't the violence. The most terrible thing was how people gradually stopped thinking independently, how they began believing there was only one correct way to live, one correct way to be a wizard." "So what will we do?" Elara asked. "Research," Aziz answered decisively. "If MIPs are really dangerous, we have to prove it, using scientific method." They divided the tasks. Aziz was to analyze the technical aspects of MIPs and their effect on the castle's magical field. Poppy was to research how the technologies affected students' ability for intuitive magic. Dorian was to study historical parallels and find information about Professor Stormwind. And Elara was to observe general changes in student and faculty behavior. The following days brought disturbing discoveries. Aziz discovered that MIPs weren't just connected to the castle's energy system, they were actively modifying it. Using a special spell he found in an old magical engineering manual, he was able to see the magical energy flows in the castle. And what he saw frightened him. "Look," he whispered, showing his friends the results of his spell in an empty room on the 6th floor. Thin threads of multicolored energy glowed around them. This was Hogwarts' magical aura. Previously, this aura was chaotic, alive, constantly changing. Each part of the castle had its own unique energy signature. Indeed, the aura looked strange. Instead of natural chaos of colors and forms, the energy flows were becoming increasingly regular, forming geometric patterns. "And now look at this." Aziz directed the spell at the nearest MIP. The panel was surrounded by a perfectly symmetrical grid of blue energy lines that spread to the surrounding space, gradually correcting the castle's natural magical chaos. "They're not just using the castle's energy," Poppy realized with horror. "They're changing it, making it more sterile." Dorian brought no less disturbing news about Professor Stormwind. It turned out that before coming to Hogwarts, he had worked in a secret ministry department that dealt with optimization of magical processes. This department was created after the war with the official purpose of preventing tragedy repetition through non-standard use of magic. "So they want to control the way wizards use magic?" Elara asked. "It seems so," Dorian nodded. "And Hogwarts is just the first stage. If the experiment works here, MIPs will be implemented in all magical schools worldwide." Poppy made the most terrible discovery. She conducted a series of tests among students of different years, checking their ability for intuitive magic, spells created not by instructions, but by a wizard's inner feeling. "The results are catastrophic," she reported during their next meeting. "Students who actively use MIPs have almost completely lost the ability for creative magic. They can perform any spell if they know the exact technique, but they can't create anything new." "What about the teachers?" Elara asked. "Older professors are holding on for now, but younger ones..." Professor Vector told me yesterday that her own research in arithmancy seems non-optimal compared to MIP recommendations. Most disturbing was what Elara observed daily. Students were becoming not just less creative, they were becoming less human. They precisely completed all assignments, perfectly answered all questions, but lost what made them unique personalities. Laughter in the corridors became rarer. Jokes became more predictable. Even romantic relationships, which had always been a source of drama and emotion in the teenage environment, became rational and optimized. "We're turning into magical robots," Elara realized with horror. Meanwhile, spring finally came to Hogwarts. March brought the first green shoots and warm rains. But even the nature around the castle was changing in a strange way. Trees grew too evenly, grass too uniformly, and flowers bloomed in perfect symmetry. One day, when Elara was walking the grounds, she noticed that even the whomping willow, an aggressive plant that had always fought with everyone who approached, now moved with predictable mechanical movements. Even magical plants are becoming standardized, she thought sadly. That same evening, an event occurred that finally convinced them that action needed to be taken immediately. During dinner in the Great Hall, all the candles suddenly went out. A strange metallic sound echoed in the darkness, and then light returned. But now, instead of thousands of multicolored candles, The hall was illuminated by MIPs installed along the walls. Their cold blue light made the great hall look not like a cozy home dining room, but like some technological laboratory. Students looked around with surprise, but quickly adapted to the new lighting. Too quickly. Technical improvement, Professor Stormwind announced. MIPs provide more efficient and stable lighting than old-fashioned candles. But Elara noticed that the ghosts became almost invisible in the blue light, as if they were fading. And the portraits on the walls looked somehow less alive, flatter. After dinner, she ran to Professor McGonagall's office. "Professor," she said breathlessly, "we have to act. Right now." McGonagall looked up from her papers. "What happened, Miss Stonebridge?" "They replaced the candles. This isn't just lighting, it's the final step toward complete castle transformation." Elara quickly told her about all their discoveries over recent weeks. The headmistress listened carefully, then stood and went to the window overlooking the school grounds. "I noticed the changes too," she said quietly. "Even in myself. Sometimes I catch myself thinking that my decisions should be more optimal. It frightens me more than anything else. So what will we do?" McGonagall turned to her. "Tomorrow, representatives from other magical schools arrive at Hogwarts to evaluate the success of the MIP program. If they give a positive assessment, the system will be implemented worldwide." She paused. "We have one night to find irrefutable evidence of MIP's danger." "How?" "We need to penetrate the main system hub and gather data on exactly how they affect the castle's magic and students." McGonagall took an old map of Hogwarts from her drawer. "Based on my observations, the central MIP processor is installed somewhere in the dungeons, probably near the castle's old foundations." "You want us to break in there?" "I want you to save Hogwarts," the headmistress answered seriously, "and the magical world along with it. I'm afraid this is a task for those younger and braver than I." Elara felt enormous responsibility settle on her shoulders. But along with it came determination. Hogwarts was her home, her friends were her family, and magic was part of her soul. She wouldn't allow all of this to be transformed into cold algorithms and standardized procedures. "We'll do it," she said firmly. "Then prepare," McGonagall replied. "You have until midnight. After that, it will be too late." When Elara walked back to her dormitory, she looked at Hogwarts' familiar corridors with new eyes. How many generations of students had walked these corridors? How many dreams, hopes, discoveries, and friendships had been born within these walls? And would all of this disappear forever, replaced by efficient algorithms and optimized processes? No, she decided. Not if she could stop it. Time to gather the team and embark on the most dangerous adventure of her life. At midnight, Elara crept quietly through Hogwarts corridors, holding in her hand the old castle map that Professor McGonagall had given her. Her heart beat so loudly it seemed audible throughout the corridor. But the castle was helping her. The floor didn't creak under her feet, and the shadows seemed deeper than usual, as if Hogwarts itself was trying to hide her from the watchful eyes of the MIPs. At the appointed place, by the statue of the One-Eyed Witch on the third floor, her friends were already waiting. Aziz carried a bag with various magical devices for analysis. Poppy had a small backpack with healing potions just in case, and Dorian held an ancient spellbook he had secretly taken from the family library. "Everyone ready?" Elara whispered, looking at the map. According to Professor McGonagall's markings, the shortest path to the dungeons led through Hogwarts' kitchen, and from there through old tunnels known only to the castle's most ancient inhabitants. "Ready," her friends replied almost in unison, and Elara heard in their voices the same determination that burned in her own heart. They set off downward, avoiding the main corridors where prefects might patrol, or worse, Professor Stormwind might catch them, who was rumored to often wander the castle at night. The journey to the kitchen took almost half an hour. They had to hide from Filch and his cat several times, and also bypass zones where MIPs scanned the corridors with blue beams. Hogwarts' kitchen greeted them with silence and darkness. Even the house elves seemed to be sleeping, which was unusual. They normally worked around the clock, preparing food for the next day. But in the blue light penetrating through the windows, Elara noticed something disturbing. Even here, in the heart of the castle's domestic comfort, stood a MIP, quietly humming and pulsing. "They're everywhere," Aziz muttered, approaching the panel with his magical field detector. "Look at these readings. The MIP isn't just standing here, it's actively scanning everything around, recording every magical impulse, every spell." "Why do they need to scan the kitchen?" Poppy wondered. "Because cooking food is also magic," Dorian realized. House elves use the purest, most intuitive magic that exists. If MIPs can standardize even them. He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. If even house elves lost their natural magical intuition, the last living magic in Hogwarts would disappear forever. According to Professor McGonagall's map, the entrance to the old tunnels was hidden behind a huge portrait of Sir Lancelot that hung by the entrance to the wine cellar. But when they approached the portrait, they found that the knight was sleeping deeply and didn't respond to their quiet calls. Strange, Elara muttered. Hogwarts portraits never sleep so deeply. They're always vigilant. Aziz directed his detector at the portrait and frowned. The magical field here is altered too. As if someone reduced the portrait's liveliness. Do MIPs affect portraits too? Poppy asked. Seems so. They make all magic more predictable, more controlled. And less alive. Dorian approached the portrait and gently touched the frame. Sir Lancelot, he whispered, we're trying to save the castle. We need your permission to pass. The knight stirred in his sleep, but didn't wake. Then Dorian did something unexpected. He placed his hand on his heart and said quietly, I swear by my family's honor that we act for Hogwarts' good. Even if my lineage is stained with dark deeds, I myself choose the light. These weren't just words, this was magic. Not a spell, not a technique, but sincere magic of heart and honor. And the portrait responded. Sir Lancelot slowly opened his eyes, looked at Dorian, then smiled. A son of Not who chooses honor over heritage, he whispered. Pass, young knights, and may fortune favor you in your noble quest. The portrait creaked and swung aside, revealing a dark tunnel leading into the castle's depths. The tunnel turned out to be older than they had expected. The walls were lined with rough stone blocks that still bore ancient runes and symbols. The air here was thick and heavy, filled with echoes of centuries of magic. This is part of Hogwarts' original foundation, Aziz whispered, illuminating the walls with a Lumos spell. Look at these runes, they were carved by the founders themselves. Indeed, symbols resembling the four house crests could be seen on the stone, but in more archaic forms. Here was Gryffindor's lion, but with eyes full of ancient wisdom, not just courage. Hufflepuff's badger, surrounded by symbols of fertility and growth. Ravenclaw's eagle with spread wings, as if flying through a starry sky. And Slytherin's serpent, but not threatening, but wise, biting its own tail, a symbol of eternal renewal. They weren't enemies, Poppy said with surprise. The founders. Look how their symbols intertwine with each other. The division came later, Dorian nodded sadly. My great-great-grandfather told me that initially the houses weren't rivals, but complementary parts of one whole. Courage, wisdom, loyalty, and ambition. All of this is needed for a complete person. As they walked through the tunnel, Elara noticed that magic here felt different. It was rawer, more primitive, but at the same time more alive than anywhere in modern Hogwarts. As if the very walls remembered times when magic wasn't a tool, but part of life. Suddenly Aziz stopped, looking at his detector. Something strange here, he muttered. The magical field is changing, becoming more structured. Ahead, the tunnel widened, forming a large circular chamber with a high ceiling. And what they saw there exceeded their worst expectations. In the center of the chamber stood a huge MIP, not like those in classrooms, but a real monolithic crystal as tall as a person, pulsing with intense blue light. Energy webs extended from it in all directions, connecting it to dozens of smaller panels installed along the walls. The entire chamber hummed with magical energy, but this wasn't the living, chaotic energy of Hogwarts, but something cold and mechanical. But most terrifying were the figures around the central crystal. 3 people in dark robes stood in perfect symmetry, their eyes glowing with the same blue light as the MIP. They moved synchronously, like parts of one mechanism, recording data on magical tablets. Professor Stormwind, Elara whispered, recognizing one of the figures. But this wasn't the Stormwind they knew from the Great Hall. His face was devoid of any emotion, and his movements were mechanically precise. He wasn't just a MIP supporter, he had become part of the system. My God, Aziz whispered, looking at his detector readings. The central MIP isn't just collecting data, it's reprogramming the magic of the entire castle. Look at these energy flows. On the detector screen, thousands of energy threads could be seen extending from the central crystal, penetrating through Hogwarts' entire structure. They reached every classroom, every corridor, even the student dormitories. They're not just standardizing education, Poppy realized with horror. They're standardizing us. forcing our brains to think the way the system wants. Dorian clenched his fists. This is worse than Imperius. At least under Imperius, a person knows they're being controlled. But here they make us think we're choosing to become like this ourselves. Suddenly one of the figures by the central MIP turned toward them. It was a young woman with empty, glowing eyes. "Unauthorized intrusion detected," she said in a mechanical voice. "Activating neutralization protocol." All the MIPs in the chamber flared with brighter light, and Elara felt something trying to penetrate her mind. It wasn't physical pressure, but something subtler, as if someone was gently whispering to her that resistance was pointless, that it was better to simply accept the inevitable, become part of an efficient system. "No," she exclaimed and focused on her brightest memories of Hogwarts, on her friend's laughter, on the first time she managed to cast a spell, on the feeling of home that the castle gave her. The others also resisted in their own ways. Aziz muttered scientific formulas, trying to preserve rational thinking. Poppy concentrated on healing instincts that came from the heart. And Dorian spoke the names of everyone he loved, like a spell against forgetting. Their resistance worked. The mental pressure weakened, and they could move. "Quickly!" Elara shouted. "We need to stop the system before it calls for backup." Aziz ran to the central MIP, trying to find a way to shut it down. But the crystal was protected by a magical field that repelled any attempts to approach. "I can't reach it," he shouted. "The field is too strong." Meanwhile, the figures around the crystal began moving faster, and their voices merged into a single mechanical chorus. "Neutralization, optimization, assimilation." "I need to make contact with the castle itself," Elara suddenly realized. "With its original magic. It's here, in the foundation. I can feel it." She ran to one of the ancient walls and placed her hands on the stone runes. Under her fingers, the stone was warm, as if alive. Hogwarts truly was alive, and it was suffering. "Help us," she whispered. "We're trying to save you. Save all of us." And the castle responded. The runes on the wall flared with golden light, but not the cold blue light of MIPs, but warm, living radiance of true magic. This light spread across all the chamber walls, then through all the ancient tunnels and foundations of the castle. The central MIP hissed and began crackling. Its blue light flickered, fighting the golden glow of ancient runes. "System malfunctioning," muttered one of the controlled figures, and the first notes of humanity appeared in her voice. "Now!" Aziz shouted and directed all his detector's power at the central crystal. Poppy joined him, using healing magic to cure the distorted energy. Dorian spoke protective spells, creating a barrier around them. And Elara kept her hands on the ancient runes, feeling Hogwarts' own magic flowing through her. Not standardized, not optimized, but alive, changeable, beautiful in its imperfection. The central MIP couldn't withstand the double pressure, the ancient castle magic and modern knowledge of her friends. It cracked, then shattered into thousands of bright fragments. Instantly, all MIPs in the chamber went out. The controlled people swayed, then fell, but they were breathing, and humanity appeared in their eyes again. What was I doing?" Professor Stormwind muttered, looking around in horror. "Oh God, what have I done to the castle?" But they had no time for explanations. From somewhere above came the sound of footsteps. Backup had arrived after all. "We need to run," Dorian said, helping the confused professor to his feet. "No," Elara said decisively. "We need to go up and tell everyone the truth, before it's too late." When they emerged from the dungeons, Hogwarts was already awakening to a new day. But this was a different castle from the one that had fallen asleep yesterday. The golden light of ancient runes still flickered in the corridors, and candles burned again with their warm, living flame. Portraits smiled, ghosts merrily flew through corridors, and the castle itself seemed to sigh with relief. In the great hall, Professor McGonagall was waiting for them along with representatives from other magical schools who had arrived to evaluate the MIP program. "Where is Professor Stormwind?" sternly asked one of them, a tall man with an accent that marked him as a representative from Durmstrang. "Here," said Stormwind himself, stepping out from behind the students. His face was pale, and his eyes held genuine remorse. "And I have something to tell you about MIPs." What Professor Stormwind told them shocked even Elara, though she had suspected the worst. MIPs weren't created to improve education, but to control wizards. The system was supposed to gradually erase each wizard's individuality, making everyone predictable and manageable. "After the war with Voldemort," he confessed, Some in the ministry decided that the problem wasn't dark magic as such, but the unpredictability of wizards. What if everyone thought the same way, used magic the same way, then there would never be wars again. But that would mean the end of magic as a living force, said the Beauxbatons headmistress, a French witch with silver hair. Magic without creativity, without individuality, that's not magic, that's technology. The representatives of the magical schools were unanimous in their decision. The MIP program was immediately shut down, and all panels were dismantled. Hogwarts became itself again. But most important for Elara was something else. When they sat in Gryffindor's common room that evening, she looked at her friends and saw that they had become themselves again. Aziz was experimenting again with unusual spell combinations, creating little miracles that had no practical use but were beautiful. Poppy was intuitively mixing healing potions, relying on feeling more than instructions. Dorian was smiling, a real, living smile that said he had finally fully accepted himself. You know what's strangest? Elara said, looking at the fire in the fireplace, which again danced in unpredictable patterns. I thought we were saving Hogwarts from technology, but actually we were saving it from fear. Fear? Aziz wondered. Fear of unpredictability, of the fact that people can make mistakes, think differently, choose their own paths. She smiled. But that's exactly what makes us human. Our mistakes, our differences, our creativity. And our friendship, Poppy added. MIPs couldn't have created friendship like ours, because real friendship isn't optimization, but accepting each other as we are. Dorian raised his mug of hot butterbeer, which the house elves had brought them, again cheerful and creative in their magic. To imperfection, he said. To mistakes that make us human. To magic that lives in the heart, not in algorithms. Poppy raised her mug. To friendship that's stronger than any control systems. Aziz added. And to Hogwarts, Elara concluded, which taught us that true strength isn't in perfection, but in remaining ourselves, no matter what happens. They clinked their mugs, and their laughter echoed throughout Gryffindor Tower. Somewhere far away, the ghosts' laughter responded, and the portraits on the walls nodded approvingly. Hogwarts was alive again, and it was home again. A year had passed since the day MIPs were dismantled from Hogwarts. March 2026 brought true spring, not the artificially perfect one that magical technologies had tried to impose, but a living, chaotic one, beautiful in its unpredictability. Trees bloomed not in perfect symmetry, but some earlier, some later, creating a picturesque, diverse carpet of colors. Grass grew unevenly, forming natural patterns that were more beautiful than any geometric schemes. Elara sat by the lake, watching the giant squid lazily basking on the water's surface. Beside her, Aziz was trying to calibrate his new magical drone, one of the devices that had emerged over the year after the MIP collapse, when the magical world began approaching technology with a new perspective. Still can't figure out why it flies sideways, he muttered, looking at the tablet showing video from the drone's camera. Theoretically, the balance of magical fields should be perfect. Maybe that's the point. Elara smiled. Maybe it doesn't want to fly perfectly. Maybe it has its own personality. Aziz looked at her with surprise, then laughed. You know, maybe you're right. After the whole MIP story, I've started understanding that not everything has to be perfect to be wonderful. Indeed, Aziz had changed after their adventure. He was still fascinated by technology, but now approached it differently. Instead of trying to create perfect devices, he experimented with combining magic and technology in ways that complemented each other rather than replacing one another. His drone, for example, could record video from unique angles unavailable to ordinary Muggle cameras, thanks to magical stabilizers. But at the same time, it had its own whims. Sometimes it stopped to look at a particularly beautiful landscape, or made unexpected shots that turned out much more interesting than planned ones. Look at this, Aziz said, showing Elara the tablet. On screen was a bird's-eye view video. Students from different houses sitting together on a clearing, some reading, some playing guitar, others just enjoying the sun. The drone chose this shot itself. I was planning to film the castle's architecture. Maybe it understands that true beauty isn't in stone walls, but in the people who make a place alive, Elara suggested. Poppy and Dorian approached them. Poppy held a magical smartphone, one of the new devices that had been developed over the year after the MIP program's collapse, learning from past lessons. Unlike the controlling panels, these phones were created for communication convenience, without trying to change users' way of thinking. The girls from Beauxbatons just sent a video from their school, she reported joyfully, showing the screen. On it, French students demonstrated how they combined traditional magic with modern communication methods. Their patron uses delivered messages through a virtual network, creating real wonders. And students from Ilvermorny proposed creating an international project, Dorian added, looking at his own phone. They want to research how different magical traditions can interact through modern technologies. But not for standardization, he quickly added, noticing the worried expression on Elara's face, but for mutual understanding. Elara smiled. That sounds much better. Using technology to learn more about our diversity, not to destroy it. They approached closer to the group of students on the clearing. Here was an amazing picture. A Ravenclaw girl was reading an e-book on a magical tablet, but the book reacted to her emotions, changing the color of its pages. A Hufflepuff boy played guitar while his smartphone recorded the melody and automatically created magical notation. A group of Slytherins discussed some project using holograms that appeared above their phones. Do you see the difference? Elara said quietly to her friends. Now technology serves us, not the other way around. It helps us be more creative, more connected to each other, but doesn't force us to think alike. Yes, Aziz nodded. The difference is in philosophy. MIPs tried to make us better by changing who we are. These technologies simply give us more opportunities to be ourselves. Poppy showed them a messenger chat where students from different schools exchanged potion recipes, but each added their own unique ingredients and methods, creating incredible diversity of approaches to the same goal. Look, she said, scrolling through messages. A girl from Castelobruxo adds tropical flower petals to a standard headache potion, and a boy from Durmstrang uses ice from Scandinavian fjords. Everyone gets the same result, but the path to it is unique. This is real progress, Dorian said thoughtfully. Not unification, but diversity united by a common purpose. Evening found them in Gryffindor's common room, where traditional fireplace coziness combined with soft light from several magical gadgets. Elara looked at this picture and thought about how much her understanding of the world had changed over recent months. Several younger students sat by the fireplace, playing a magical version of a video game on their tablets. But instead of disconnecting from reality, the game encouraged them to study real spells and magical history. 2 fifth-years talked with friends from other schools through video calls, but their conversation was about how to preserve each school's unique traditions in an age of globalization. You know what struck me most in this whole story? Elara said, settling into her favorite chair by the window. Not that technologies can be dangerous, but how important it is to ask why, and not just how. What do you mean? Aziz asked, setting aside his tablet with plans for a new invention. MIPs were technically perfect. They really could make our spells more precise, more powerful, more efficient. The question, how does this work, had a wonderful answer. But we forgot to ask, why do we need this? And what will we lose in the process? Poppy nodded thoughtfully. Like in medicine, sometimes the best medicines can have side effects worse than the disease itself. It's important to treat the whole person, not just the symptom. And now we know how to ask the right questions, Dorian added. When I see new technology, I ask myself, will it make me a better person or just a more efficient machine? Aziz smiled. And the best part is that we didn't reject technology completely. We learned to use it wisely. Indeed, life at Hogwarts was now an interesting mixture of old and new. Students still learned from ancient textbooks, but could discuss complex topics with peers from other continents. They practiced traditional spells, but recorded their successes and mistakes using magical devices to analyze their own progress. The portraits on the walls had learned to interact with new technologies, not as victims, but as equal participants. Sir Cadogan could now give interviews to student journalists through video links, and the fat lady had created her own blog about fashion through the centuries. Even the ghosts adapted in their own way. Nearly headless Nick mastered the art of photobombing, appearing in the most unexpected places in student photos. And Moaning Myrtle became the school's unofficial psychologist, counseling students through a special smartphone app. Do you remember Professor Stormwind? Elara suddenly asked. I wonder what happened to him. The last news I heard, he's working on a new project, Dorian replied. But now it's something radically different. He's researching how technology can help wizards better understand their own uniqueness, not hide it. Really? Poppy was surprised. Yes. He's creating a system that analyzes each wizard's magical signature and helps find an individual style of spellcasting. Like a magical fingerprint, but instead of forcing everyone to be the same, It emphasizes what makes each person unique. That's wonderful, Elara smiled. So he really learned from his own mistakes. Outside the window, the sun was setting behind the forbidden forest, painting the sky in warm colors. Elara looked at this landscape and thought about how much had changed over recent months. Not only in Hogwarts, not only in the magical world, but in herself. She was still an ordinary girl, without special magical talents. Her grades remained average, spells sometimes didn't work on the first try, and potions occasionally exploded instead of helping. But now she knew this was normal, that her value wasn't in perfection, but in remaining herself despite pressure to become someone else. You know what's best about our story, she told her friends. We didn't become heroes who saved the world from great evil. We simply reminded everyone, including ourselves, that being human is good. And that friendship really can change the world, Poppy added, smiling. And that questions are sometimes more important than answers, Aziz said. And that even the darkest family legacy can be overcome, Dorian added quietly. They sat in silence, enjoying the moment. Outside the window, the first stars twinkled, and logs crackled merrily in the fireplace. Somewhere far away came the laughter of students, and the melody someone played on a flute drifted from the corridors. Suddenly Poppy's phone chimed with a message. She glanced at the screen and laughed. What is it? Elara asked. The girls from Beaux Batons are asking if we'd like to participate in an international project studying magical history. They want to create an interactive map of all the world's magical schools with stories about their traditions. Sounds interesting, Aziz nodded. I could help with the technical part. And I could help with historical research, Dorian added. And I could contribute healing traditions from different cultures, Poppy smiled. Everyone looked at Elara. And me? She asked. I don't have any special talents. You have the most important thing, Aziz said seriously. You know how to ask the right questions. And remind us that it's important to remember humanity in everything we do. Elara felt warmth in her heart. Maybe she really didn't have unique magical abilities. But she had something no less valuable, the ability to see what others missed and remind everyone of what was truly important. Then I agree, she said, but with one condition. What? Her friends asked. We'll do it our way. Not perfectly, not according to the best algorithms, but as our hearts tell us. With mistakes, with experiments, with all our imperfections. It couldn't be any other way, Poppy laughed. When they were going to bed, Elara looked out the window at Hogwarts once more. The castle glowed with thousands of lights, warm candles in old corridors, soft light from magical technologies in modern rooms, starlight gleaming above the towers. This was a living, breathing organism that combined centuries of history with possibilities of the future. And most importantly, it remained home. Home for everyone who valued not perfection, but authenticity. Not efficiency, but humanity. Not uniformity, but diversity. Somewhere in the castle's depths, a choir of ghosts began singing, not perfectly, a bit off-key, but with soul. Portraits chatted with each other, discussing the day's events. And in the dormitories, students fell asleep to the sounds of messages from friends in different corners of the magical world. Elara smiled and went to her room. Tomorrow would be a new day, full of new possibilities, new challenges, and new adventures. Over this year, she had learned much, and most importantly, to meet each day being simply herself, surrounded by friends who accepted her as she was. And that, she thought, falling asleep to the quiet humming of the castle, was the best magic of all. The magic of real life, where imperfection wasn't a flaw, but a feature. Where diversity wasn't a problem, but wealth. And where technology served not to change people, but to help them become better versions of themselves. Hogwarts was home again, and this time forever.